The night in Georgia was heavy with mist, and the river whispered secrets no man should hear. Under the ghostly glow of the moon, the master's wife knelt by the water, her silk dress torn, her face streaked with tears. Behind her, footprints disappeared into the river's edge. By morning, the plantation would buzz with rumors of curses and betrayal, and at the center of it all was me, Elias, a slave whose name the wind would never forget. They say the Georgia sun burns differently on the backs of men in chains. It doesn't just scorch the skin, it melts away the soul, slow and steady, until you forget what it feels like to be free. I was born under that sun, on the sprawling lands of Magnolia Creek Plantation, in the year 1815. My first breath was taken beneath a sky too wide, too blue, for someone meant to live his whole life behind another man's shadow. Mama used to tell me that when I was born, thunder rolled across the valley like a drumbeat, and the overseer spat, saying the storm had come to deliver another worker. I grew up to the rhythm of that storm, the crack of the whip, the moan of the tired, the silent weeping that filled the nights when the wind carried our prayers away before God could hear them. Every day began before dawn. The air was wet, heavy, and full of the smell of earth and sweat. I picked cotton until my fingers bled raw, till I couldn't tell where the soil ended and my blood began. The overseer's voice rang through the fields like a curse, and even the birds stayed quiet when he passed. Master Gideon Carter owned the plantation, a man whose smile was as thin as the blade he carried. His boots never touched the mud. He walked as though the earth itself feared to stain him. He was cruel in the quiet way, never shouting, just smiling as he broke a man. I saw it too many times to count. His wife, Miss Lillian, was a different kind of quiet. She looked like she belonged to another world, skin pale as ivory, hair the color of harvest wheat, and eyes that always seemed to be looking far away, as if she saw something that wasn't there. She'd stand on the balcony, lace gloves on her hands, watching us in the fields like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. Nights in the quarters were filled with whispers. The old ones prayed, the young ones dreamed, and the rest of us just tried to survive until morning. I remember Mama singing low songs about freedom, songs she said were older than the river, songs that could carry a man's soul beyond his pain if he believed hard enough. But even those songs grew quiet when the overseer's torchlight moved between the cabins. I was 16 when Mama died. They said it was fever, but I knew better. Her hands had grown thin, her breath shallow, and her back bent from too many years in the field. I buried her under a willow tree by the edge of the creek, where the water could whisper her name. That day, the sun rose blood red, and I swore to myself that I'd never die a slave. After that, I worked harder, but I also watched harder. I learned to listen when white men thought I couldn't hear, to move in silence, to study every shadow and every path that led into the forest beyond the plantation. I learned what freedom looked like by memorizing the stars. Years passed like smoke, faces came and went, but the chains never changed. Until one summer day in 1834, when the air was thick enough to choke and the cicadas screamed loud enough to drown thought, I went down to the river to fetch water, and saw her, Miss Lillian, alone. She was kneeling by the riverbank, her dress soaked, her hair loose, her hands digging into the mud like she wanted to bury something. Her face was streaked with tears, her lips trembling. I froze where I stood. A slave was not meant to see his master's wife like that. Not crying, not broken, not human. For a long moment, I just stood there, the wooden bucket heavy in my hand, the river light glinting like fire. She lifted her head, and our eyes met. There was no command in hers, no coldness, only fear. She looked at me as if I were the last person on earth who could understand her. Then, in a voice soft enough to be mistaken for wind, she whispered one word. Help! The sound of it cut through me. I didn't know what kind of help she meant, or if it was even real. Before I could speak, she stood, wiped her face, and hurried away, vanishing between the trees like a ghost dissolving at dawn. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her voice echoed in my head. Help. It wasn't a plea. It was something else. Something heavier. The next morning, Master Gideon left before sunrise with his dogs and rifle. When he returned at dusk, his boots were caked in mud and blood. Nobody asked questions. Nobody dared. But the look in his eyes told me that the river was no longer a place for washing or drinking. It had become something darker. And deep down, I knew whatever Miss Lillian had done, or whatever Gideon thought she'd done, it had already begun to change the fate of everyone at Magnolia Creek. After that morning when Master Gideon returned with blood on his boots, the world around Magnolia Creek seemed to change its breathing. The fields grew quieter. Even the birds avoided the cotton rows, as though the land itself had become afraid of what it had seen. I felt it in every gust of wind, in every creak of the wooden cabins at night. The air was heavy with something unseen, something waiting. Gideon was no longer the man who rode through the fields barking orders. He had turned into a shadow of himself, more unpredictable, more dangerous. His temper flared without warning. He drank more than he ate, and when his voice echoed from the big house, even the dogs cowered. I learned quickly that silence was our only protection. No laughter, no songs, no sound but the crack of the wind against the cane stalks. Miss Lillian disappeared from sight for weeks. The curtains of the mansion stayed drawn, and her window candle burned long after midnight. Rumors spread among the quarters like wind through dry leaves. Some said she'd fallen ill. Others whispered that she'd seen something by the river she could not unsee. Whatever truth lived inside that house, it changed her eyes, and it changed his soul. Then came the winter season of 1834. Frost crept over the fields like a silver ghost. We worked until our hands cracked, and our breath turned to steam in the morning light. The overseer's whip sang through the cold, cutting through the silence, marking the days like clockwork. Every strike echoed in my bones, not because it fell on me, but because I knew it could, at any moment. One night, while hauling sacks of seed to the barn, I saw Miss Lillian step outside. She moved like a dream, her shawl slipping off her shoulders, her eyes lost in some faraway thought. I froze where I stood, afraid to move, afraid to be seen. She turned slowly, and for a brief moment our eyes met again. The same look from the river, only this time it carried something heavier. Regret, fear, maybe even guilt. Elias, she whispered, and my name on her lip sounded like a secret. He doesn't sleep anymore. He talks to himself. About you. My heart stopped. Me? I asked, barely above a breath. She nodded, her voice trembling. He thinks I told you something. He thinks you saw. The cold cut through my shirt, but her words froze me deeper than the air. I hadn't seen anything that day by the river, but Gideon believed otherwise. And when a man like him believes something, truth becomes meaningless. That night, I lay awake in my cabin, staring at the flicker of the firelight on the walls. Every crack of wood sounded like a footstep, every whisper of wind like a door opening. I knew then that I was living on borrowed time. If Gideon had already convinced himself of my guilt, it was only a matter of days before he'd act on it. Days turned into a week, and the tension built like thunder behind the clouds. No one spoke my name, but I could feel the unease ripple through the others. They saw how Gideon watched me, how the overseer lingered near me longer than usual, his hand always resting on his belt. Something was coming. I could feel it in the slow hum of dread that filled every sunrise. Then came Christmas Eve. Every year, Gideon held a feast to show his neighbors how well he kept his people. He called it the celebration of order, a night of music, laughter, and hypocrisy. He ordered the best food prepared, the tables set with polished silver, and the quarters scrubbed clean. We served them like actors on a stage, smiling because we had to, bowing because we must. As I carried trays into the hall, I caught sight of Miss Lillian at the far end of the table. Her eyes flicked toward me once, just once, and in that single glance, I saw everything. The fear, the warning, the unspoken truth that this night was different. Gideon sat at the head of the table, his glass full, his laughter loud. But there was no joy in it, only bitterness. He looked around at his guests, then at me, his eyes narrowing, his voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. Some of you think a slave can be loyal, he said. his tone dripping with mockery. But loyalty ends when secrets start. Ain't that right, Elias? Every head turned. The hall went still. My hands froze around the tray I held. I bowed my head, but I could feel his gaze burn through me. That was the moment I realized the truth. No matter how much I worked, how much I obeyed, or how quietly I lived, Gideon would never stop seeing the ghost he thought I was. Something inside me shifted that night. The kind of shift that comes when fear finally burns itself into resolve. And as the laughter resumed, echoing against the tall walls of that cursed house, I knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. This would not be my last Christmas on Magnolia Creek, but it would be his. After that Christmas night, nothing on Magnolia Creek felt real anymore. The laughter from the great hall had faded into silence, but the echo of Gideon's voice still lived in my ears. Every word he'd spoken had carved its mark on me like the lash of a whip. I could still see his smirk, still hear the guest's chuckle, still feel the shame burning in my chest. It was the moment I stopped being afraid and started waiting. Days passed, slow and thick as molasses. The fields were dead now, wrapped in winter frost. Work slowed, but the tension did not. Gideon watched me like a hunter watches his prey. Even when I couldn't see him, I could feel him, his presence like a shadow behind every door, every tree, every breath. Miss Lillian avoided me completely, her curtains always drawn. Only her candle burned each night, the flame trembling in her window as though warning me to stay away. Then one morning, the overseer came to my cabin with a message. "The master wants you by the smokehouse," he said flatly. I felt the words settle in my stomach like lead. Still, I went. When a man like Gideon calls, you don't refuse. You walk toward your fate and pray it doesn't notice your heartbeat. He was waiting by the fence, coat open, eyes glassy with drink. The dog sat behind him, restless, growling low. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared at me with a look I couldn't read. Finally, he said, "You ever wonder why some men live and others hang, Elias?" His voice was calm, too calm. I said nothing. His hand rested on the rifle leaning beside him, his thumb tracing the metal. "I think it's because God likes a story," he said, smirking faintly. "And yours is about finished." I didn't answer. I stood there, still as stone, as he turned and walked back toward the house. He didn't look back, but I knew. That was his warning. A man like Gideon didn't threaten twice. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared into the dying fire, listening to the creak of the walls and the whispers of the night. Something inside me had gone beyond fear, beyond anger. It was a quiet, steady certainty. I realized I didn't want revenge because of hate anymore. I wanted it because it was the only way to end the noise that had lived in my soul since birth. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the sound of the river. I remembered the first time I'd seen Miss Lillian cry there, and how her voice had trembled when she said, "Help." Now, I understood. She hadn't been asking for rescue. She had been confessing to the only person who couldn't repeat it. The river had taken her secret that day, and now it was coming to take mine. The next morning, I began to plan. Not with words, not even with thoughts, just actions. I fixed fences slower, took the long way around the stables, learned which doors creaked and which didn't. I watched the routines of the house like a man counting the seconds before a storm hits. The cook left the kitchen after dusk. The overseer checked the barns at midnight. The dogs slept light until their master drank enough to silence them. Every night, I learned something new about how the world of that plantation moved. Miss Lillian crossed my path only once in those days. It was late afternoon, and the sun had dipped behind the trees, throwing long golden shadows across the yard. She stood on the veranda, her hands clutching the railing, her face pale against the dying light. When she saw me, she hesitated, then whispered, "He's leaving for the church gathering tomorrow. Alone." Her voice trembled on the last word. Then she turned and walked inside. That night, I sat outside the quarters, watching the sky burn red as the sun sank behind the trees. The cold bit into my skin, but I barely felt it. I thought of Mama's words, how she once said, "When a man's soul grows quiet, that's when God listens hardest." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in my life, the silence inside me felt holy. The next morning, Gideon rode out before dawn. His horses' hooves echoed like drum beats fading into the woods. The plantation felt different without him, lighter, almost free. But I knew the feeling wouldn't last. The overseer would keep watch, and when Gideon returned, he'd bring the storm with him. So I made my choice. If freedom would not come to me, I would carve it out myself. Not just for my own name, but for every prayer whispered into the dirt, for every cry swallowed by the fields, for every chain that had sung against our wrists under that merciless sun. When the sun rose the next day, the river glowed like molten glass. The trees stood still, the air thick and silent. I looked toward the big house, its white walls gleaming like bone, and I felt something deep inside me settle. The story of Magnolia Creek wasn't over, but it was about to begin again, this time written in my hands. The morning air was heavy, damp with mist, and the sound of the river rolled low like thunder hiding beneath the earth. I stood by the edge of the woods, my hands trembling, my breath clouding in the cold. Gideon had not yet returned, but I knew he would. Men like him always came back, drawn by the need to remind the world who held the whip. That day, though, something in the air felt different. The plantation was too quiet, too still, like it knew what was coming and chose to hold its breath. When the dogs began barking, I knew it was time. Their voices cut through the fog, followed by the sharp rhythm of hooves on the dirt road. I could almost see it, his black horse breaking through the trees, his coat billowing, his laughter echoing like a storm's first roar. My heart pounded in my chest, but not from fear anymore. No, fear had died a long time ago. What I felt now was something deeper, calmer, the kind of stillness a man feels when he's already stepped past the edge. I waited by the smokehouse, where the ground was soft and the air smelled of ash. Inside, the coals still glowed faintly from the night before, their red light pulsing like a heartbeat. I could hear footsteps, his boots on the wooden path, slow, confident, unaware. He was humming a tune I remembered from the Christmas feast, the one he'd sung while raising a toast to his guests. The same tune that played in my head every night since. He stopped at the doorway. "You fixing to work or to pray, Elias?" he drawled, voice thick with amusement. I didn't answer. My hands were still, my eyes on the coals. He laughed, stepped closer, his boots crunching on the straw. "Can't tell which one a man like you does more of, work or praying, though neither seems to get you very far." He was standing right behind me now, close enough that I could smell the brandy on his breath, the leather of his gloves, the faint scent of smoke that never seemed to leave him. That was when the first crack split the silence, the sharp pop of burning wood, a spark jumping free from the pit. It landed near his boot. He cursed, took a step back. I turned to face him. For a moment, we just stood there, two men bound by the same soil, but chained by a different kind of fire. His eyes narrowed. "What you staring at?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," I said quietly. "Just wondering if God still listens here." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What are you?" Before he could finish, the wind changed. The flame that had been dying in the pit suddenly roared to life, hungry and wild, reaching for the walls like a living thing. He stumbled back, shouting, the dogs barking in panic outside. I didn't move. The fire spread fast, licking through the dry straw, curling up the wooden posts. Smoke filled the air, thick and bitter. I could barely see him now, his shape twisting in the orange haze. He tried to grab me, but I stepped aside, his hand catching only the edge of my shirt. He fell to one knee, coughing, eyes watering from the smoke. The roof began to creak, timbers cracking one by one like bones breaking under pressure. And in that moment, I saw it, the same fear he had carved into others now blooming in his own eyes. He tried to speak, but his words broke into coughs. I turned away. The air was too thick to breathe, too hot to think. I could feel the fire biting at my back as I stepped outside, the cold wind slamming into me like a wave. The smokehouse was already alive, the flames climbing higher, devouring everything. From the porch of the big house, Miss Lillian stood frozen, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with something I couldn't name. Fear, maybe, or freedom. For a long second, our eyes met through the haze. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just watched. Behind me, the fire roared like Judgment Day. The dogs had scattered, the overseer shouting orders in panic. The air was filled with the sound of chaos, cries, snapping wood, the shriek of burning metal. But through it all, I heard only one thing: silence. That deep, endless silence inside me that no sound could break. I walked toward the river, my shadow long and thin against the burning fields. The water shimmered with the reflection of the fire, turning red and gold like molten glass. I knelt at the edge, dipped my hands into the cold current, and let the ash wash away. For the first time, I didn't feel chained. The plantation burned behind me, but I didn't turn back. Some fires are meant to destroy. Others are meant to cleanse. And as the sun began to rise over Magnolia Creek, I realized I had become both. Morning came like a ghost, pale and trembling, crawling across the smoking ruins of Magnolia Creek. The air was heavy with the smell of wet ash and scorched earth. The fire had eaten half the barns and left the house hollow and black, its white walls now stained with soot like the ribs of a burned cathedral. I stood at the edge of the field, my clothes still warm from the heat, my hands streaked with soot, and I wondered if the world was ending or beginning. The other slaves had gathered near the quarters, silent, their faces lit by the dull gray dawn. No one spoke my name, but every eye found me. In that silence, I felt something pass between us. Not words, not even understanding, but a kind of prayer carried without sound. They knew. And though fear still hung in the air like smoke, beneath it was something else. Relief. The kind that tastes like the first breath after nearly drowning. By midday, word had already spread to the neighboring plantations. Riders came, their coats dark with soot, their horses snorting from the smell of fire. The overseer spoke fast, pointing, blaming, sweating. But no one could find Gideon. Some said he'd fled into the woods, half burned, crawling toward the river. Others whispered that he'd been taken by the flames themselves, swallowed whole by the fire he once used to light his cigars. Miss Lillian sat on the veranda steps, her white dress streaked with ash. She didn't cry this time. She just stared at the smoke curling into the sky, her hands clasped together like she was praying for something she no longer believed in. When our eyes met, she didn't flinch. She simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if to say, "It's done." Then she looked away, and I knew that whatever bond had existed between us was sealed not in love, but in silence. The overseer tried to keep order, shouting commands that no one obeyed. The fields lay empty, the fences broken, the animals scattered. The plantation had become a graveyard of men, of pride, of the idea that one man could own another. As dusk fell, I went down to the river. The same river where she had once cried, where I had once stood powerless. The water was calm now, reflecting the orange glow of the dying fires. I knelt and listened to it, half expecting to hear voices, the whispers of those who'd suffered here, the laughter of the lost, the cries of those who'd been silenced. But the river spoke only in murmurs, carrying everything away like it always did. I thought of Mama, of her stories of freedom told in the dark when no one was listening. She used to say, "Freedom don't come from running. It comes when the fear leaves your bones." I finally understood. I hadn't escaped yet, but the fear was gone. That alone felt like freedom. That night, I walked past the quarters one last time. Some of the people were already packing small bundles of clothes, food, keepsakes. Others just sat by the fires, staring at the horizon. I wanted to tell them something, to say I was sorry, or proud, or ready, but no words came. The silence said enough. I left before dawn. The road was long and empty, stretching through pine woods and swampland, the air cool and thick with mist. Every step carried the sound of my past fading behind me, the crack of the whip, the clank of chains, the murmur of the river. The sun climbed slowly, painting the world in pale gold, and for the first time I could walk without looking over my shoulder. They never found Gideon's body. Some said he'd been seen near the river, his face half burned, wandering aimless through the trees. Others said his ghost haunted the ashes of Magnolia Creek, his laughter echoing through the ruins each winter night. Maybe both were true. As for Miss Lillian, they said she left soon after, took her carriage north, and never returned. The house she left behind became nothing more than charred timbers swallowed by weeds. But sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I can still smell the smoke, faint and distant, and I wonder if the land remembers what happened here. Maybe it does. Maybe every blade of grass, every tree, every whisper of river keeps the story alive, long after names and bodies are gone. And so I walk, toward nothing, toward everything, carrying a silence that no master can break. Years have passed since that night, yet the memory of the fire still follows me like a second shadow. I see it sometimes when I close my eyes, the orange glow against the dark sky, the sound of wood snapping, the smoke twisting upward like the souls of the lost. It doesn't frighten me anymore. It's just part of me now, like a scar the body learns to wear without pain. Magnolia Creek is gone, but its ashes still speak in the wind, whispering of what was taken and what was finally returned. I live far from those fields now, somewhere the river runs quieter, slower, as if even the water needs rest after carrying so much sorrow. Some nights I sit by its edge, listening to the murmur of the current, and I remember the faces that never got to leave. Mama's soft hum in the dark, little Ben's laughter, Ruth's tired smile. I remember the songs we used to sing when the overseer's footsteps faded into the distance. Songs about freedom, though none of us had ever seen it. Now I hum them alone, not out of joy, but so the river won't forget the tune. Sometimes I ask myself if what I did was right. If the fire I started that night burned away the chains or only changed their shape. The world still feels cruel, still heavy, still full of men who think they can own another man's breath. But when I remember Gideon's eyes in that smokehouse, the fear that finally found him, I realize that justice doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers. It's not about vengeance. It's about balance, about the earth reclaiming what was stolen from it. There are nights when the wind blows from the south, carrying the faint scent of magnolia, and I swear I can hear Miss Lillian's voice, soft as it was by the river that day. Maybe she found peace. Maybe she didn't. I like to think she learned that sorrow doesn't wash away. It roots itself in you until you decide to turn it into something else. That day by the river, when she cried, I thought she was weak. Now I understand she was breaking in the only way the world allowed her to. I don't dream often, but when I do, I see the river and the fire side by side, the water and the flame, one to cleanse, one to destroy. And standing between them is me, neither saint nor sinner, just a man who wanted to be free. The older I get, the more I realize that freedom isn't a place. It's a silence. It's the space between the whip cracking and the heart still beating. It's the moment when you look at the dawn and realize you're still alive. I've met others since, runaways, wanderers, men who've buried their names to survive. When they ask me where I come from, I tell them Georgia. But not the way a man names a home. I say it the way a man names a wound. Some of them know Magnolia Creek. They tell stories about a plantation that burned down one winter night, about a master who vanished and a woman who disappeared north. They never know the truth, not the way I do. I just listen, nod, and let the legend grow, because sometimes stories are the only kind of freedom we get to keep. One night, a boy asked me, "Did you ever go back?" I looked at him for a long time before I answered. "No," I said softly. But the land did, because I believe the earth never forgets. It remembers every step, every cry, every drop of blood. It just waits for the right fire to set it free. As I sit here now, the river glows in the moonlight, smooth and endless. I dip my hands into it, just like I did that morning after the fire. The water is cold, pure, forgiving. I whisper into it, not for God, not for Gideon, but for all of us who were never meant to be heard. The words drift away, carried down the current toward the sea. And in that moment, I finally understand what Mama meant when she said, "Freedom don't come when chains break, Elias. It comes when you stop hearing them rattle. The night is quiet now, the world hushed and still. The fire is long gone, but its light still flickers inside me. And though my hands are scarred and my heart heavy, I know this much is true. I am no longer owned. I am no longer hunted. I am free.